Sometimes the quietest moment in a prison is the one right before something impossible happens. At 5:42 on a cold Tuesday morning, the execution wing of Redwood State Penitentiary was quieter than it had been in years. The long concrete corridor held the kind of silence that made even experienced guards lower their voices without realizing it. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while a digital clock on the far wall counted down the final minutes of a routine that the prison staff had performed many times before. But nothing about this morning felt routine. At the center of the room sat Angela Brooks, a 34-year-old inmate who had spent the last 6 years on death row. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, her posture straight, her breathing slow and steady as if she were sitting in a waiting room instead of a place designed for final moments. Officer Daniel Reeves stood near the door, arms crossed, watching her the way guards are trained to watch inmates during critical procedures, alert but detached. In his 12 years working corrections, he had seen many different reactions during these final hours. Some people trembled. Some cried. Some tried to speak endlessly, as if words alone could slow down time. But Angela Brooks had done none of those things. She had simply sat there quietly, the same way she had sat during the past 6 years of prison life. Across the room, Warden Harold Whitaker checked his watch and glanced toward the prison chaplain, Father Michael Donovan, who stood silently with a small Bible folded in his hands. The process was moving exactly according to schedule. Paperwork signed. Witnesses prepared. Protocol followed to the letter. And yet something about the woman in the chair unsettled the room in a way no one wanted to admit out loud. Angela didn't look frightened. She didn't look angry. If anything, she looked patient. As if she had been waiting for this morning for a very long time. The clock changed from 5:42 to 5:43. The quiet hum of the ventilation system filled the room again. Warden Whitaker stepped forward, clearing his throat gently, the formal tone of procedure settling into his voice. "Angela Brooks," he said, reading carefully from the document in his hand, "you are entitled to make a final request before the sentence is carried out." It was a line he had spoken more than a dozen times in his career, a sentence that usually produced a last meal request, a final phone call, or a brief prayer. But Angela lifted her head slowly and looked directly at the warden with calm brown eyes that seemed far steadier than anyone expected. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, clear, and completely certain. "Before this happens," she said, "I would like to see the Virgin Mary." For a moment, no one in the room moved. Officer Reeves blinked, certain he had misheard her. The chaplain's grip tightened slightly on the small Bible in his hands. Even the warden paused, the practiced rhythm of procedure slipping just slightly as the words hung in the air. Redwood State Penitentiary had handled hundreds of final requests over the decades. But no one in that room had ever heard one like that before. And what none of them realized yet was that the next 10 minutes would become the most talked about moment in the entire history of that prison. For several seconds the room remained completely still. The kind of stillness that spreads when people hear something they cannot immediately understand. Warden Harold Whitaker lowered the document in his hand and studied Angela Brooks carefully, as if expecting her to smile or admit that the request had been a strange attempt at humor. But Angela did not smile. She simply sat there, her hands resting gently together, her expression calm and almost thoughtful. Officer Daniel Reeves shifted his weight near the doorway and glanced toward another guard across the room, silently asking the same question that was now forming in every mind inside the chamber. Had she just said what they thought she said? Father Michael Donovan stepped forward slightly, his voice quiet but respectful. "Angela," he said gently, "when you say you want to see the Virgin Mary, do you mean you would like to pray?" Angela turned her head toward the chaplain. Her eyes were steady, and there was no confusion in them. "No, Father," she replied softly. "I want to see her." The answer settled over the room like a cold breeze. Officer Reeves let out a small breath through his nose and rubbed the back of his neck. In his experience, last requests sometimes came from deep emotion or confusion, especially when someone was facing the final hour of their life. People asked for impossible things. When they were afraid. But Angela Brooks did not sound afraid. She sounded certain. Warden Whitaker cleared his throat again and spoke carefully, maintaining the calm authority that years of leadership had trained into his voice. "Angela," he said, "the facility can provide a moment for prayer with the chaplain if you wish. But we cannot arrange what you are asking for." Angela looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger. Not with disappointment. Just with that same quiet patience that had unsettled the room earlier. "You will not need to arrange it," she said. "She is already on her way." The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. Officer Reeves frowned slightly. One of the technicians monitoring the room glanced up from the equipment panel, unsure whether he should react or simply continue his work. Father Donovan looked down at the small Bible in his hands and then back toward Angela, as if searching her face for some deeper meaning. Outside the reinforced glass observation window, the first light of early morning was beginning to creep across the prison yard. Redwood State Penitentiary sat nearly 30 miles outside the nearest city, surrounded by flat farmland and quiet highways that rarely saw traffic before sunrise. The execution wing had always felt isolated from the rest of the world. But now that isolation seemed heavier somehow, as though the entire building were holding its breath. The digital clock changed again. 5:44. Warden Whitaker glanced at it automatically. Procedure demanded that the process continue on schedule unless there was a legal reason to delay it. And yet something about the atmosphere in the chamber made him hesitate longer than usual. Angela Brooks sat without moving, her gaze drifting briefly toward the small window high on the wall where the pale morning light was slowly growing brighter. Officer Reeves followed her eyes for a moment and then looked back at her. "Angela," he said carefully, trying to keep his tone neutral, "what makes you think something is going to happen?" Angela did not answer immediately. She simply looked at the window again, then back at the people gathered in the room. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a calm certainty that made several people glance at the clock once more. "Because," she said quietly, "this is the moment she told me about." The room remained quiet after Angela spoke those words, but the silence no longer felt ordinary. It carried a tension that none of the officers could explain. Warden Harold Whitaker folded his hands slowly behind his back and studied the woman sitting in the chair as if he were seeing her for the first time. In 6 years of reviewing inmate files and overseeing difficult decisions, he had learned to recognize fear, anger, and desperation. Those emotions appeared in many different forms, but they always left traces in a person's voice or posture. Yet Angela Brooks showed none of them. Her breathing remained slow and steady. Her shoulders were relaxed. She looked less like a person facing the final minutes of her life and more like someone waiting for an appointment that she knew would arrive on time. Officer Daniel Reeves shifted again near the door and glanced toward the digital clock mounted high on the wall. 5:45. The seconds moved forward with quiet precision. Normally the execution chamber felt controlled and predictable, like a place where every step followed a carefully written script. But now the script seemed to have slipped slightly off track. Father Michael Donovan watched Angela closely, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. Over the years he had spent many hours speaking with inmates during their final days. Some people searched for forgiveness. Others searched for peace. Angela had always been different. She rarely asked questions about her own future. Instead she asked questions about faith, about patience, about the meaning of forgiveness in situations where the truth remained hidden. The chaplain remembered one conversation from months earlier when Angela had told him quietly that time did not always move in the way people believed. At the time he had assumed she was simply trying to comfort herself. But now those words returned to his mind with surprising clarity. Warden Whitaker stepped toward the center of the room and spoke carefully, his voice firm but controlled. "Angela," he said, "you mentioned that someone told you about this moment. Who exactly are you referring to?" Angela turned her head slowly toward him. The faint light from the small high window brushed across her face as the sun continued rising outside the prison walls. Her expression remained calm, almost reflective, as though the answer were something very simple. "I told you," she said quietly. "The Virgin Mary." Officer Reeves exchanged a quick glance with another guard across the chamber. Neither man spoke, but the look they shared carried a mixture of disbelief and uncertainty. Redwood State Penitentiary had processed thousands of inmates over the decades, and the staff had heard many unusual statements from people under stress. Yet Angela Brooks did not sound confused. Her voice carried a calm certainty that made it difficult to dismiss her words as imagination. The clock changed again. 5:46. The pale sunlight creeping through the window grew slightly brighter, stretching across the concrete floor in a narrow strip of gold. Angela lifted her eyes toward the light for a moment, almost as if she were measuring the passing seconds by its movement. Father Donovan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Angela," he said gently, "when did you believe you saw her?" Angela looked back at him with the same peaceful expression. "Not today," she answered softly. "She came to me 2 nights ago." The statement caused a faint stir in the room. Warden Whitaker frowned slightly. Officer Reeves straightened his posture. The technician at the equipment console looked up again. Angela continued speaking in the same calm tone, as if she were describing something completely ordinary. "She said the truth would arrive with the morning light," Angela said. "And that everyone in this room would see it." The words settled into the room slowly, as if they needed time to be understood. For several seconds no one spoke. The quiet hum of the ventilation system returned, and the soft ticking of the digital clock became strangely loud against the concrete walls. 5:47. Warden Harold Whitaker felt the weight of the moment pressing on his sense of responsibility. Protocol was clear, and the process was meant to move forward without unnecessary delays. Yet something about Angela Brooks and the calm certainty in her voice made it difficult to simply dismiss what she had said. He studied her face again, searching for signs of panic or confusion. But Angela did not appear distressed. She looked the same way she had looked during every meeting he had ever had with her over the years. Calm. Focused. Almost patient. Officer Daniel Reeves walked 2 steps closer to the center of the chamber and lowered his voice. "Sir," he said quietly to the warden, "do you want us to continue preparations?" Whitaker did not answer immediately. Instead he looked toward Father Michael Donovan, who had been listening carefully to every word Angela had spoken. The chaplain slowly exhaled and glanced toward the small window high on the wall where the morning sunlight continued to grow brighter. "Angela," Father Donovan said gently, "when you say she came to you 2 nights ago, what exactly happened?" Angela lifted her eyes toward him. For the first time since entering the chamber, a faint expression of reflection crossed her face, as if she were remembering something very clear in her mind. "I was in my cell," she said softly. "It was late. The lights in the hallway had already dimmed. I thought I was alone." Officer Reeves folded his arms again, listening despite himself. Angela continued in the same steady tone. Then the room felt different. Not louder. Not brighter. Just different. Like the air had changed. The technician near the equipment console shifted slightly in his chair but said nothing. Angela looked again toward the growing strip of sunlight stretching across the floor. "She stood near the door of my cell," Angela said quietly. "Not the way a person stands. More like light standing in the shape of someone." Father Donovan remained silent, allowing her to continue. "She did not speak with words," Angela said. "But I understood what she wanted me to know." Warden Whitaker felt the room grow even quieter. Even the guards who had been skeptical earlier were now watching Angela more carefully. Not because they believed her story, but because she spoke about it with such calm certainty that it demanded attention. Angela slowly lowered her eyes back toward the floor before speaking again. "She told me that the truth would arrive with the morning light," Angela said. "She told me that today would not end the way everyone believes." The digital clock changed again above them. 5:48. Outside the window, the rising sun pushed another beam of pale gold into the chamber, stretching farther across the grey concrete. Officer Reeves glanced toward the light and then back at Angela. "What truth?" he asked quietly before he could stop himself. Angela looked directly at him. Her voice remained soft, but the certainty inside it had not changed. "The truth about why I am here." Officer Daniel Reeves did not expect an answer when he asked that question, but Angela Brooks continued looking at him as if the answer had been waiting for years to be spoken. The sunlight from the small window had now stretched several feet across the floor, touching the edge of the steel chair where she sat today. The digital clock above the chamber door shifted again. 5:49. In most execution procedures, the room followed a rhythm that every officer knew by heart. Each minute had its purpose. Each movement had its place. But now that rhythm had slowed. Warden Harold Whitaker remained standing in the center of the room, watching Angela carefully while the staff waited for his signal to continue. Angela spoke quietly, but every person in the chamber could hear her clearly. "The truth about the woman whose death brought me here," she said. The words caused a small shift among the officers. Some of them had only read the summary of her case years earlier when she first arrived at Redwood State Penitentiary. Others had followed the trial more closely when the verdict made regional headlines. Angela Brooks had been convicted of the death of a local business owner named Margaret Hill, a case that prosecutors described as simple and certain. Evidence had placed Angela inside the building that evening. Witness statements had supported the timeline. And after a trial that lasted 9 days, the jury returned its decision. Since that day, Angela had maintained the same quiet statement whenever the subject appeared. She had always said she was innocent. Officer Reeves had heard those words before from other inmates. Some people held on to denial even when the evidence was overwhelming. But Angela had never argued loudly. She had never blamed anyone else. She had only repeated the same calm sentence every time someone asked her about it. "I did not do what they believe I did." Now the execution chamber felt even quieter as the memory of that case returned to the room. Father Michael Donovan looked at Angela with a thoughtful expression. "Angela," he said gently, "many people have heard you say that before. But today you seem certain something is about to change." Angela nodded once, slowly. "Because it will," she said. Warden Whitaker folded his arms as he considered her words. "And what exactly is supposed to change in the next few minutes?" he asked. Angela lifted her eyes toward the growing light again. The golden beam now reached the middle of the chamber floor, bright against the gray concrete. She spoke as though she were describing something already decided. "The truth is coming here," she said softly. Officer Reeves frowned slightly. "Truth does not walk through prison doors," he said before thinking about the weight of his words. Angela did not argue. She simply looked back at him with the same steady calm that had unsettled everyone in the room since the morning began. "It does when someone finally decides to tell it," she replied. The digital clock changed again. 5:50. Outside the reinforced walls of Redwood State Penitentiary, the quiet highway leading toward the prison entrance was beginning to catch the early sunlight of a new day. Inside the chamber the air felt heavier than before, as if the room itself were waiting. Warden Whitaker finally turned toward the guards near the door and spoke quietly. "Check the main gate," he said. "See if there is any unexpected activity." Officer Reeves nodded and reached for the radio on his belt. As he pressed the button and began speaking to the control station at the front entrance, Angela Brooks sat silently beneath the growing beam of morning light, watching the seconds pass as if she already knew what the next minute would bring. Officer Daniel Reeves held the radio close to his mouth while the room remained completely silent around him. The soft crackle of the communication channel seemed unusually loud inside the execution chamber. "Control, this is Reeves in the execution wing," he said steadily. "Warden Whitaker wants confirmation from the main gate. Any unexpected arrivals this morning?" For a moment there was only static. Angela Brooks sat quietly beneath the widening beam of sunlight, her eyes resting on the bright strip of gold that now stretched nearly halfway across the floor. The digital clock on the wall changed again. 5:51. A voice finally answered through the radio, calm but slightly puzzled. "Control to Reeves. Stand by." The brief pause felt longer than it should have. Warden Harold Whitaker remained perfectly still while he waited, his expression focused but unreadable. Father Michael Donovan lowered his head slightly, holding the small Bible in both hands as if he were preparing for a prayer that might or might not be needed. The technician at the equipment console glanced toward the door, then toward the clock again. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The radio crackled once more. "Reeves, we do have activity at the front entrance," the voice reported. Reeves looked toward the warden immediately. "What kind of activity?" he asked. Another short pause followed. "A vehicle arrived about 2 minutes ago," the control officer replied. "County police escort. They are requesting immediate access to the administration building." A faint ripple of surprise moved through the room. Warden Whitaker stepped forward. "Did they give a reason?" Reeves asked into the radio. The response came quickly this time. "They said they are transporting someone with urgent information connected to an old case. They asked to speak with the warden immediately." Reeves slowly lowered the radio and looked at Whitaker. The warden said nothing for several seconds. Instead he glanced toward Angela Brooks, who remained seated in the chair exactly as before. The sunlight had now reached the front legs of the chair, glowing softly against the metal frame. Angela looked toward the window again, then back toward the people gathered around her. Her expression had not changed. She simply nodded once, as though the message on the radio had confirmed something she already expected. Officer Reeves noticed the movement. "You knew someone was coming," he said quietly. Angela did not answer right away. She allowed the silence to stretch across the room for another moment before speaking. "I told you the truth was coming," she said softly. The digital clock moved forward again. 5:52. Warden Whitaker finally turned toward Reeves. "Bring them here," he said. "If someone has information connected to this case, I want to hear it before we continue." Reeves raised the radio again and relayed the order to the front gate. As the message traveled through the prison communication system, Angela Brooks closed her eyes briefly and took a slow breath. The morning light continued to brighten the chamber, spreading across the concrete floor inch by inch. And somewhere beyond the thick prison walls, a vehicle carrying a stranger with a story was already moving down the long corridor toward the execution wing. The corridor outside the execution chamber was usually empty at this hour, but now the distant echo of footsteps began to travel slowly through the concrete hallway. Officer Daniel Reeves heard it first. A steady rhythm of shoes against the polished floor, accompanied by the faint jingle of keys and the low murmur of voices approaching from far down the passage. Everyone in the room turned toward the closed steel door at almost the same moment. The digital clock shifted again. 5:53. Warden Harold Whitaker stood motionless near the center of the chamber, listening carefully as the sound grew closer. Redwood State Penitentiary had thick walls and long corridors, and noise usually faded before it reached the execution wing. But these footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing second. Angela Brooks remained seated beneath the widening beam of sunlight, her posture unchanged. The light now touched the front of her shoes, glowing softly against the gray floor. Her eyes lifted briefly toward the door, then returned to the golden strip of light stretching across the room. Officer Reeves quietly adjusted the radio on his belt while the approaching footsteps finally stopped just outside the chamber. For a brief moment there was silence again. Then the heavy door opened with a low metallic sound. 2 county police officers stepped inside first, their expression serious but controlled. Behind them walked a middle-aged woman wearing a dark blue jacket and carrying a thin folder pressed tightly against her chest. Her face looked pale from the early morning light, and her eyes moved quickly around the room before settling on Warden Whitaker. One of the county officers spoke immediately. "Warden Whitaker, thank you for seeing us so quickly," he said. "This is Detective Laura Bennett from the County Investigative Unit." The woman stepped forward slowly. Her voice was calm, but there was urgency behind it. "Warden, I apologize for the interruption, but we have information connected to the Margaret Hill case." The name hung in the air for a moment. Angela Brooks lifted her head slightly at the sound of it, though her expression remained calm. Whitaker studied the detective carefully. "You realize what is scheduled to happen here this morning," he said. Detective Bennett nodded once. "Yes, sir. That is exactly why we came." She opened the folder she had been holding and removed a single document along with a small sealed evidence envelope. Late last night we received new testimony connected to the case. Someone finally came forward. Officer Reeves felt a small shift of tension move through the room. The technician at the console leaned forward slightly, listening without pretending otherwise. Father Michael Donovan remained silent, watching Angela with quiet attention. Whitaker looked at the envelope. "And this testimony changes the situation?" he asked. Detective Bennett hesitated for only a second before answering. "It may change everything." The digital clock moved forward again. 5:54. Whitaker accepted the document from her and began scanning the page. His expression changed slowly as he read, his eyes moving carefully across the lines of typed words. After several seconds he lowered the paper slightly and looked toward Angela Brooks. Angela was already watching him. The sunlight now reached nearly to the center of the room, filling the chamber with a warm glow that had not been there when the morning began. Angela spoke quietly, almost as if she were confirming something that had already been decided. "The truth has arrived," she said. The execution chamber remained silent as Warden Harold Whitaker continued reading the document Detective Laura Bennett had handed him. His eyes moved slowly across each line, the faint reflection of the rising sunlight catching the edge of the paper in his hands. For several seconds no one in the room spoke. Even the officers who had been standing near the door seemed to hold their breath. The digital clock on the wall shifted forward again. 5:55. Whitaker finally lowered the document slightly and looked back at the detective. "You are certain about this statement?" he asked. Detective Bennett nodded immediately. "Yes, sir. The individual who came forward last night signed a sworn affidavit. The statement was recorded and verified by the county prosecutor's office before sunrise." She gently placed the sealed evidence envelope on the metal table beside the console. "And this," she added, "is the physical evidence that supports the testimony." Officer Daniel Reeves leaned forward slightly, trying to understand what was happening without stepping out of position. Redwood State Penitentiary had followed strict procedures for decades, and interruptions during the final minutes of an execution were almost unheard of. Yet the room now felt like it had stepped outside of that routine entirely. Father Michael Donovan watched the exchange quietly while Angela Brooks remained seated beneath the widening beam of sunlight. The warm light now reached the center of the chamber floor, casting a soft glow around her chair. Angela's expression had not changed since the detective entered the room. She looked calm, almost peaceful, as if every word spoken so far had confirmed something she had already expected. Warden Whitaker turned back to the document in his hands. "According to this statement," he said slowly, "a man named Thomas Keller came to the county office late last night claiming he has carried information about the Margaret Hill case for years." Detective Bennett nodded again. He said he could not live with the silence any longer. He admitted that the testimony given during the original investigation was incomplete. Reeves felt the tension in the room deepen. Whitaker continued reading aloud from the document. "Keller states that on the night Margaret Hill died, he was present in the building shortly before the police arrived. He says he saw another individual leaving through the rear hallway." The words seemed to echo through the chamber. Angela Brooks slowly lifted her eyes toward the warden. The sunlight now touched the edge of her chair and reflected softly against the steel frame. Whitaker looked up from the page again. "Why did he wait until now to say this?" he asked. Detective Bennett exhaled slowly before answering. According to his statement, he believed the case had already been decided and that coming forward would not change anything. But when he learned the execution was scheduled for this morning, he contacted our office immediately. The digital clock shifted again. 5:56. Whitaker placed the document on the table beside the sealed envelope and looked around the chamber. The routine schedule that had guided the morning only minutes earlier now seemed distant and uncertain. Angela Brooks watched the rising sunlight spread across the floor, then looked back toward the warden with the same calm certainty she had shown since the beginning. Her voice remained soft when she spoke again. "I told you the truth would come with the morning light," she said quietly. The execution chamber remained quiet as the weight of Detective Laura Bennett's words settled over everyone in the room. The golden light from the rising sun now filled nearly half the floor, reflecting softly off the metal surfaces and turning the cold grey chamber into something warmer than it had been only minutes earlier. Warden Harold Whittaker stood beside the small table with the document and sealed envelope resting in front of him. For a long moment he said nothing. His eyes moved from the paper to Angela Brooks and then back again, as if he were measuring the distance between what had been believed for 6 years and what might now be changing in a single morning. The digital clock on the wall moved forward again. 5:57. Officer Daniel Reeves shifted his stance near the door, his attention moving between the warden and the detective. Redwood State Penitentiary had followed strict procedures for decades, and the staff inside the chamber knew exactly how the next minutes were supposed to unfold. Yet none of those procedures had expected a moment like this. Father Michael Donovan stepped slightly closer to Angela, his expression thoughtful but calm. Angela Brooks remained seated beneath the warm beam of sunlight, her eyes steady and peaceful as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Detective Bennett gently pushed the sealed envelope a few inches closer to the warden. "Sir," she said quietly, "the evidence inside confirms that another individual was present in the building that night. It was never examined during the original investigation." Whittaker placed one hand on the envelope but did not open it immediately. Instead he looked once more toward Angela. "You said the truth would arrive this morning," he said slowly. Angela met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she replied softly. Whittaker studied her face for several seconds before turning toward Officer Reeves. The decision in his voice was clear. "Suspend the procedure," he said. Reeves nodded immediately and reached for the radio on his belt. As the order traveled through the prison communication system, the atmosphere inside the chamber shifted in a way no one had expected when the morning began. The clock changed again. 5:58. Outside the small high window the sun had fully risen above the distant fields beyond the prison walls, sending a bright line of light across the entire chamber floor. Angela Brooks slowly closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet warmth of the morning. Father Donovan watched her gently. "Angela," he said softly, "you seem very certain about everything that has happened today." Angela opened her eyes again and looked toward the bright window. "Faith teaches patience," she said quietly. "But sometimes patience leads to the moment when truth finally steps forward." Warden Whittaker turned back toward the document and the sealed evidence envelope, knowing that the next steps would involve investigators, courts, and a long review of the case that had once seemed finished. Yet inside the chamber one fact had already become clear to everyone present. The morning had not unfolded the way anyone expected. And as the sunlight continued to fill the room, Angela Brooks sat quietly beneath it, watching the new day begin with the calm understanding that the truth had finally found its way into the light.